A quiet, suburban neighborhood bathed in golden light. The air is still until a furious voice shatters the calm. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street. Elijah stood at the base of Margaret Turner's porch, the tension between them palpable. He was a small 10-year-old boy, with his worn shoes and ragged clothes. Margaret, on the other hand, was a woman who seemed to think the world owed her something, judging by the angry look on her face and the way she pointed her finger accusingly at him. "I saw him sneaking around my yard," Margaret shouted, her voice trembling with rage. "He was stealing from me, just like they always do." Elijah stood motionless, his heart pounding in his chest. His hands were tightly clutching something, a small locket he had found on the ground, forgotten in the grass. It wasn't his. He had picked it up with the intent of returning it, but now, standing in front of the enraged woman, his intentions felt meaningless. The accusation alone cut him like a knife. "I wasn't stealing," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. His hands were trembling, but he refused to let his fear show. Margaret's eyes narrowed, and she took a step forward, pointing directly at the locket he held. That's my locket. It belongs to my late husband, and this boy took it." She practically shrieked, her voice filled with disbelief and accusation. A few neighbors had gathered outside, watching the scene unfold with growing unease. Their eyes flicked back and forth between the boy and the woman, sensing the tension but unsure of what to believe. A hushed murmur ran through the small crowd. To them, it seemed like just another story of a young black boy accused of doing something wrong. The fear of being misunderstood, of being labeled, was something Elijah knew too well. Officer Daniels stood between them, attempting to de-escalate the situation. But there was a noticeable discomfort in his stance. He was caught between the heated emotions of the elderly woman and the calm, yet nervous, demeanor of the young boy. "Ma'am, let's not make any assumptions just yet," Officer Daniels said, his voice trying to remain neutral. "What exactly is missing? What's the story here?" Margaret didn't take her eyes off Elijah. "That locket," she repeated, her voice shaking with anger. "It's the only thing of value I have left from my husband. And he took it from me. That boy took it from me." Elijah's heart raced, and for a moment it felt as if the world was closing in on him. The locket was warm in his hand, the cool metal pressing against his palm. But to Margaret, it had become a symbol of everything she had lost. Elijah had no way to prove that he had found it, no way to explain the innocence in his actions. No one ever listened to him anyway, not when it mattered. He was just a black boy in a world that had already decided who he was before he even opened his mouth. The weight of that truth hit him hard, but he refused to show it. Officer Daniels looked down at the locket, then back at Elijah, who was standing quietly, still gripping it in his hands. He could feel the tension hanging in the air, thick as smoke. For a moment, the officer hesitated. He looked at Margaret, whose anger seemed to rise with each passing second, and then back at Elijah, who was visibly trembling, but still standing firm. "I'm going to need to take this locket into evidence for now," Officer Daniels said, his tone more authoritative now. He reached for the locket, and Elijah didn't resist. He felt his hands loosen, almost as if he was releasing a part of himself he had never meant to hold. Margaret was still staring at him, her face twisted in disdain. "I knew it. They're all the same." Elijah tried to look away, but he couldn't. Her words cut deeper than anything the officer could have said. Officer Daniels gestured for Elijah to follow him. "I'll be taking you in for questioning," he said, his voice cool, but with an edge of uncertainty. "Let's get this sorted out." Elijah nodded, his feet feeling heavier with every step he took. This was the life he had come to know, accused, misunderstood, and helpless. But as they walked, one thought stood out in his mind. It didn't matter what happened next. He hadn't done anything wrong. He just wished someone would believe that. A moment passed, but it felt like an eternity. Elijah knew the truth, but no one was asking him. He wasn't given that chance. And as the sirens wailed in the distance, the question lingered in the air. Would anyone ever listen? Would anyone ever believe him? The air was thick with tension, the murmurs of the crowd lingering like a heavy fog. Elijah stood still, his tiny hands clutching the locket tightly. His heart raced, and his palms were sweaty. All he could hear was the sound of his own breath, and the accusations that had been hurled at him moments earlier. He had never felt more exposed. Officer Daniels stepped forward, kneeling to bring himself to Elijah's level. His stern eyes softened, but there was still suspicion in his voice. "Son, if you really didn't steal it, why not just give it back?" Officer Daniels asked, his tone attempting to be calm but firm. Elijah's grip on the locket tightened as his voice cracked, but he didn't back down. He had been through enough in his young life to know what it meant to stand his ground. "I can't. It's mine too," he replied, his voice small but steady. The words hung in the air for a second, but Margaret couldn't keep her anger in check any longer. She stepped forward, her face twisted with rage. "What kind of nonsense is that?" "This locket belonged to my husband for 50 years, she yelled. "You people always take what isn't yours. This is why we can't trust." Her words echoed in the now silent crowd. The hate in her voice cut through the air like a blade. Elijah flinched, but he didn't let go of the locket. His chest tightened, and for a split second he wanted to run, to disappear. But then he looked up at her. Something inside of him snapped. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hatred. It was a quiet, heavy resolve. His eyes, once filled with uncertainty, now burned with the weight of the truth. "Ask him," Elijah said, his voice trembling with emotion but firm in its conviction. "Ask your son. He gave it to me." A sudden stillness filled the street. The words hung in the air like a promise. Officer Daniels looked up at the older woman, his eyes widening. "Wait, what do you mean, son?" he asked, the confusion evident in his voice. He turned back to Elijah, searching his face for a hint of the truth. Elijah felt a lump rise in his throat, but he didn't hesitate. He had already spoken the truth, and now there was no going back. He wasn't just a scared little boy anymore. He was someone who had a right to be heard. He took a shaky breath before looking up at Officer Daniels and replying, "The locket, your son gave it to me. He said it was for my mom, but I didn't know how to get it to her." The officer's face changed. It was subtle, but the realization seemed to hit him all at once. He stepped back and glanced toward the crowd, his eyes flicking back to Margaret. "Your son gave him the locket?" Officer Daniels asked cautiously. He knew something was off. His gut told him there was more to this than it seemed. Margaret's face faltered. Her earlier confidence cracked, and she stepped back, her gaze darting between her son and the small boy who was now standing tall in front of her. Elijah didn't say another word, but the truth was there, written across his face. He wasn't some thief. He wasn't just a kid caught in the crossfire. He had a story to tell, one that was now being heard. But would anyone believe it? The street was silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. The crowd waited for Margaret's response. Would she admit the truth? Would she listen to the boy who had been cast aside his entire life? As Officer Daniels looked between them, a quiet realization settled in. This wasn't about the locket anymore. It was about trust, about seeing beyond assumptions. Would Margaret see Elijah for who he truly was, or would she let her prejudices blind her? No one moved. The entire street seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The quiet street was interrupted only by the sound of distant cars passing by, but Elijah's heart raced as he stood before Margaret. The heavy locket in his hand felt like a weight that had been growing for years. He stood there, trembling, as Margaret's face twisted in confusion. "My son, he's been gone for years. You're lying." Margaret's voice was sharp, as if disbelief could make Elijah's words disappear. But he wasn't lying. His heart clenched as he took a deep breath. "No, I'm not. My mom told me everything before she died," Elijah replied, his voice shaking but steady. Margaret stepped back, her face clouded with doubt. The people around them watched, unsure of what would happen next, their eyes moving between the boy and the woman. The pressure of the moment seemed to thicken the air, as if the whole street was holding its breath. Elijah's small hands were still clutching the locket, his fingers tightening around it, as if he needed it to hold himself together. He had to get this right. He couldn't let the truth slip away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. The edges were frayed, and the creases in the paper were deep, showing how many times it had been handled. With a steady hand, he passed it to Officer Daniels, who was standing close by, watching the scene unfold. Daniels took the letter carefully, unfolding it as his eyes scanned the words. He read aloud, his voice low but clear. "Dear Elijah, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you. But you deserve to know the truth. Your father loved you. He wanted to be in your life, but he was scared of how his family would react. You see, your father was Charles Turner, the same Charles Turner who was Margaret Turner's son. He wanted to tell her, but he never got the chance. So if you ever find her, show her this. Tell her that the locket I gave you was his. It was the only thing he left behind." Officer Daniels' voice faltered slightly as he finished reading, his eyes flickering toward Margaret. The street was eerily silent. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and the faint hum of the city. But the silence was thick, suffocating, as everyone waited for Margaret's reaction. Margaret's face drained of color as she took a small, stumbling step back. Her lips trembled. Her gaze fixed on Elijah as the truth of his words settled over her. The locket, the one she had thought was stolen, was a gift from her own son, Charles. Her mind reeled as the pieces of a long-hidden past began to shift into place. The crowd that had gathered whispered among themselves, exchanging knowing glances. The truth had broken through, and with it, everything changed. Margaret's expression softened, the anger and disbelief melting into something deeper. Regret, perhaps, or sorrow. Her eyes filled with tears as she finally saw Elijah for who he truly was. Not just a boy she had thought was a thief, but her own flesh and blood. Elijah stood there, waiting, his heart pounding. He had always wondered if this moment would come, if he would ever find the person who could make him whole again, the person who would connect the dots of his past. Now, standing before him, was the woman who was his grandmother, the woman who had once been part of his family's history, the woman who had unknowingly played a role in his mother's painful life. It was a lot to take in. The secret, hidden for so long, had come rushing to the surface. The feeling of being lost and abandoned was no longer just his. It was shared by Margaret as well. The weight of the truth was unbearable. The neighborhood around them buzzed with quiet chatter, but Elijah could only focus on Margaret's face. She looked older now, more fragile than the woman he had seen standing in front of the store. Her eyes filled with an unspoken apology, a silent acknowledgement of the years that had been lost. This was more than just a stolen locket. It was a lost family, torn apart by time and secrets. The locket had been a token of something real, a bond between a mother and a son. It had traveled with Elijah through years of hardship, passed down from his mother in her final moments, and now it had found its rightful place in his hands. Elijah opened his mouth ready to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? What could anyone say? There were no easy answers, no way to undo the pain, but at least now the truth was known. And that, he thought, was a start. Tears fill her eyes. Her hands shake. No, this can't be. Margaret's trembling hands reach for her chest as she struggles to catch her breath. She's been holding onto the weight of grief for so long, trying to move on from the loss of Charles, the man she had loved. But Elijah is a link to him, a reminder of a part of her life she thought was gone forever. I never knew he had a child," Margaret gasps, almost in disbelief at the admission, as though speaking the words might make them true. Her voice cracks, and she collapses into her hands, her tears falling onto the floor like raindrops. Elijah watches her, his heart racing, his own emotions tangled in a mess of hope and fear. He's never seen her like this before, broken, vulnerable, and lost. He always knew there was more to the story, but never imagined it would unfold like this. Margaret's sobs grow louder as her body shakes, her grief spilling over. Elijah stands, unable to move, but desperate to comfort her, to tell her that he was here now, that he wasn't going anywhere. The walls that Margaret had built around her emotions begin to crumble. The stoic, dignified woman he had once feared now seemed so fragile, so human. For a moment, Elijah feels like an outsider again. But this time, something feels different. This time, Margaret isn't looking at him with cold eyes or judgment. She isn't seeing him as a stranger or as someone unworthy of her time. She sees him as her blood, her flesh. And, as her sobs subside, Margaret lifts her tear-streaked face, her hands still trembling as she reaches out toward him. "Come here," she whispers through her tears. Elijah doesn't hesitate. He crosses the room in quick steps, kneeling beside her. Her arms open, and for the first time, he feels the warmth of her embrace. It's not the stiff, formal hug of an acquaintance. It's a mother's embrace, a grandmother's longing to hold the child she never knew she had. Her arms wrap around him, pulling him close. "I'm so sorry," she whispers, the words almost drowned by her tears. "I'm so sorry for everything." Elijah's own tears finally escape. He doesn't fight them. They mix with hers. He's waited his whole life for someone to tell him they cared, to tell him they loved him, even if it was a person who had been a stranger before today. "I didn't mean to hurt you," Margaret continues, her voice soft now, filled with guilt. I didn't know you were out there, waiting." "I was," Elijah says quietly, his voice hoarse. "I was waiting, and in that moment, the years of longing, of feeling invisible, of searching for love and acceptance, suddenly fade away." Margaret's words are like a balm to his soul, soothing the raw edges of his broken past. It's not just a reunion, it's a healing. And in the midst of the pain and the heartbreak, Elijah has found a family. The entire street stands still, watching the drama unfold. The sounds of the busy city are muffled by the tension in the air. Everyone's eyes are on Elijah and Mrs. Turner, the moments between them seeming to stretch on forever. Officer Daniels, holding the letter in his hands, clears his throat, the paper still crinkling in his grasp. He looks down at Elijah, then back at Mrs. Turner, his voice a little softer than before. "Mrs. Turner, it seems this boy wasn't stealing from you after all." The words hang in the air, heavy with their weight. The crowd shifts nervously. A few people exchange glances, trying to make sense of the situation. The accusation, the threat of criminality, it had all been so clear in their minds just moments ago. But now, something has shifted. The truth, it seems, has been revealed. Mrs. Turner stands motionless for a long moment. Her face is full of emotion, torn between shock, disbelief, and something deeper, regret. Slowly, she looks up at Elijah, her eyes softening. The pain and hardness in her gaze melt away, replaced with a quiet understanding. She lowers the letter in her hands and speaks, her voice trembling. "Come here, child." The words are gentle, but the weight of them crushes the silence that had hung between them. Elijah looks up at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and vulnerability. For a moment, he stands frozen. Could it really be? Could this woman, who just moments ago had seen him as nothing more than a criminal, now see him as something more? Could this moment of rejection be the beginning of something else entirely? He takes a small step forward. His heart beats loudly in his chest, unsure, hesitant. Every step feels like a risk, a decision that could either lead to a life-changing moment or another crushing disappointment. And then he takes another step. With one final, tentative movement, he's close enough. Mrs. Turner reaches out, her arms wide, and in that instant, the world seems to stop. She pulls him into a tight, tearful embrace, her body shaking with emotion as she holds him. Elijah, overwhelmed by the sudden warmth of the gesture, lets out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. For the first time in his life, he feels something he had almost given up hope of ever feeling again: accepted, seen. The crowd, who had been watching with bated breath, exhales in unison. The tension that had filled the air just moments ago seems to evaporate. A few people clap softly, their applause filled with the kind of understanding that comes from witnessing something profoundly human. In the silence that follows, Elijah realizes something that hits him deeper than any words could express. He is no longer alone. For the first time, he has found a place. He has found someone who is willing to see him for who he truly is, not a criminal, not a burden, but a child deserving of love and care. The soft murmur of voices fills the air, the crowd sensing the shift. The long line between judgment and understanding, between isolation and acceptance, has been bridged. The moment has shifted from one of condemnation to one of reconciliation. A new chapter for Elijah begins. Mrs. Turner pulls back slightly, still holding him by the shoulders. There are tears in her eyes, but they are not of regret anymore. They are tears of understanding. "You're not alone anymore, Elijah," she says softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Elijah nods, his throat tight as he tries to hold back his own tears. The years of uncertainty, of being pushed to the edges of society, of always feeling like he didn't belong, all of that feels like it's starting to fade away. In this moment, he's no longer just a kid trying to survive. He's someone worth loving, worth caring for. For the first time, Elijah feels what it's like to belong. As the crowd disperses, the moment lingers. The city that had once seemed so cold, so unwelcoming, now feels different. The sun shines a little brighter on Elijah's face, and for the first time, he looks ahead at a future full of possibility, love, and second chances. Do you believe in second chances? Do you think people can change and be redeemed? Share your thoughts below.